Okay, so for those who don't know, on June 11th, 2017, Puerto Rico was going to be holding a referendum to decide whether Puerto Rico remains as a territory or becomes a state or becomes an independent country. Now, a lot of people in the States sound confused and don't know the issues whenever this comes up, so I thought I'd make a video kind of explaining the basics of why so many people in Puerto Rico find this to be a difficult decision, why votes are usually 50-50, 50% in support of staying as we are, as Puerto Rico is, 50% in favor of statehood. Now, to start with, I'm going to start discussing the Government Accountability Office report to congressional requesters from March 2014 called Puerto Rico Information on How Statehood Would Potentially Affect Selected Federal Programs and Revenue Sources, because it's one of the best summaries of how statehood would either benefit or affect Puerto Rico negatively. Alright, so I've made a chart that summarizes the findings of the DAO report. I'm going to link the full report so people can verify the data on the chart. Basically, some federal programs will get more funding, some programs might receive less funding, and it all depends on assumptions. For example, in Medicare, eligibility might change, but money received will increase. So depending on how much the eligibility changes, and how much money increases, the net amount of money that Puerto Rico receives through Medicare might change. So basically, the GAO explains that under their low estimate, Medicare funding will not change. Under their high estimate, Medicare, Puerto Rico will receive an additional $1.5 billion in Medicare funds. And the bottom, at the bottom here, under income tax, Puerto Rico will start paying $2.3 to $2.2 billion in income taxes. Currently, as a territory, Puerto Rican citizens do not need to pay federal income tax. That will change if Puerto Rico becomes a state. So basically, if you sum up the changes in funding for Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, Social Security, Supplemental Security Income, and income taxes, under the low estimate, Puerto Rico will receive $400 million less in federal funding if it becomes a state. Under the high estimate, Puerto Rico will receive an additional $3.2 billion in federal funds. And it's also worth pointing out that whether you feel that statehood is a good thing or a bad thing really also depends on your income level. For example, statehood would mean increases to income tax, which would affect you if you are rich or middle class. But for example, Medicaid, an increase to Medicaid would not affect you if you are ineligible for Medicaid because you if you are rich. But if you're poor, for example, statehood would benefit you because you would begin to receive more Medicaid benefits, more SSI benefits, and more SNAP benefits. But income tax would not affect you if you're poor, because obviously poor people don't have to pay as much in income tax. Okay, now let's talk about some of the negatives. A lot of people don't know this, but whenever you buy a bottle of rum that has been produced in Puerto Rico in the United States, the tax on that rum gets transferred to Puerto Rico. Or if the rum was made in the Virgin Islands, that money is transferred to the Virgin Islands. In 2005, the amount of money transferred to Puerto Rico because of that tax was $420 million. It's remained about the same over the last 10 years. So basically, but here's the thing, that rum tax is only possible because Puerto Rico is a territory. The Virgin Islands is also a territory, that's why they also get money from the rum tax. So under statehood, Puerto Rico would stop receiving about $450 million a year in the form of Rum Tax refunds. In addition to that, there's also Act 154. That is a tax on United States corporations that do business in Puerto Rico. The IRS basically ruled that United States corporations can deduct the taxes they pay in Puerto Rico in the federal tax from the federal taxes that they would pay. So functionally, it's money that would be going to the federal government goes to Puerto Rico. Now, that tax again is only possible because Puerto Rico is a territory. If Puerto Rico becomes a state, it would stop. It would not be able to tax United States corporations, or rather, it would not. Those corporations would not be able to deduct that tax. So this tax would not be functional. Now, here's the problem. That tax, in particular, has raised about $2 billion over the last 2014, 15, 16, 3 years. It accounts for 22% of the the state budget. Although I believe in 2017 it's projected to increase to 33% of the budget. So, in the case of Puerto Rico becoming a state, it would stop receiving $2 billion a year in state revenue. So that would mean that the size of the state government would have to shrink about 20 to 30% in order to make up for the loss in revenue. That would mean cuts to basically state programs like roads and in particular state university. And that in a nutshell is why, from a purely economic perspective, statehood is so complicated and why most votes tend to be split 50-50. Under statehood, under the best case scenario, Puerto Rico would receive an additional $3.5 billion in federal funding. However, Puerto Rico would cease to receive about $3.5 billion in state funds through the form of the loss of the Rum Tax refund and Act 154 revenues, taxes on corporations. So basically, Puerto Ricans would receive more federal services such as Medicare and Medicaid, but they would stop receiving the same amount of state services, which would be roads, police, hospitals are state, and also the schools and the university are all state funded by the state. So it's really a personal decision, really, whether you would prefer to receive more federal services or receive more state services. If, for example, you work for the state government, if you're a policeman or I don't know, you work somewhere for the state government or one of the cities, you would want to remain as a territory because your job security would not be affected. If the state budget is decreased under statehood, a lot of state workers would be laid off. And now, this does not take into account the political benefits, which would be Puerto Rico would gain a number of state representatives in Congress. They would also gain 2 senators and the ability to vote for the president. But purely looking at the financial benefits of statehood, it's complicated. It's not an easy decision, and that's why if you talk about this topic, there's going to be angry opinions. There's going to be fighting, all that stuff.